Well, we now come to the last video in the last week of this course. Sort of like the end of Abbey Road. Can I do what the Beatles did so effectively? Probably not. But let's see how we can try to make sense as we try to draw some conclusions about what we've been talking about, not just this week, but over the past 6 weeks in this course. A little bit of historical framework just to give us a sense here. Paul, as I've mentioned before, quits the band in April 1970. By the time he quits the band, every other member of the band has already quit at least once. Already John has quit, George has quit, Ringo's quit. All of them have come back again. So it's kind of like the Beatles, some of the other Beatles would say about Paul and his announcing that he had taken LSD. He was the last guy to take LSD and the first guy to announce it. The last guy to quit the band, but the first one to announce it. Anyway, he must have been extremely frustrated because, like we've said, he did everything he could to try to keep the band together, but just kind of resigned himself to letting it go. Part of this had to do with Alan Klein, as we talked about before, and him managing the other three, and Paul not liking that very much at all. Part of it had to do with, through Alan Klein, the other three had okayed Phil Spector releasing The Long and Winding Road with all those extra strings and vocals, and Paul thought that was horrible. So he thought that Spector and Klein and the other Beatles had allowed one of his pieces to be mangled and turned into something that he'd never intended it to be, and that upset him. And he must have thought, well, if I stay with this group, is this going to happen over and over again? Maybe I should just have my own career where I can make all the decisions. So legal proceedings begin officially December the 31st, 1970, to break up the Beatles partnership. It takes a while for it to be all settled in court, but it is eventually settled on December the 29th, 1974. 3 days more than 11 years since the day I Want to Hold Your Hand was first released in the U.S. I Want to Hold Your Hand was released December 26, 1963 on Capitol Records in the United States, the beginning of the gigantic worldwide Beatles phenomenon. The band was officially disbanded on the 26th of December, or the 29th of December, 1974. So three days later and 11 years. An interesting anniversary, wouldn't you say? Each Beatle went on to a successful solo career in the 70s. George's All Things Must Pass, released in 1970, was #1 in the US and #1 in the UK, and produced by Phil Spector. At this point, Paul had no time for Phil Spector, but George was not only didn't mind Phil Spector on Let It Be, he hired him to do his solo record. So did John. His big album, Imagine, from 1971, #1 on both sides of the Atlantic, also produced by Phil Spector. Paul solo and with Wings during the 70s, probably the real landmark album for him during that period is Band on the Run from 1973, #1 in the US, #1 in the UK. It's produced by Paul, but it's engineered by Jeff Emmerich, who'd done a lot of the engineering for those Beatles records, so there's a real connection back to part of the Beatles legacy with Jeff Emmerich. Engineering and sort of almost co-producing the record, at least the way that Jeff Emmerich tells the story. Ringo, gosh, the other guys were afraid that in the breakup, what really sort of held them back was what will happen to Ringo. I mean, Paul, John, George, they can all have whole careers, but what's going to happen to Ringo? Well, thank you very much. Ringo did just fine, mostly as a singles artist. He had a whole series of hit singles. Not all of them were #1, but he did very, very well as a solo artist. If you ever have a chance to see the Ringo Starr All-Star Band touring through your part of the world, your part of the country, it's a fantastic show. And when you listen back to all those Ringo songs, you're surprised at how many they are. The album Ringo, for example, in 1973 went to #2 in the U.S. and number seven in the U.K. Had a #1 U.S. hit in the song Photograph, which went to #1 in the U.K. And She's 16 was also on that album and was a hit in this country. So Ringo, all of the guys did very well in the 1970s, and as they went on, unfortunately we lost John Lennon in 1980, but George continued to be very busy. I'm very fond of the Traveling Wilburys albums that he did together with Bob Dylan and Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne and Roy Orbison. Paul has remained amazingly active. There's always something new coming from Paul McCartney. And Ringo, I talked about the all-star band, has also remained very active, so that's fantastic. As we look at the band and try to think, what's the career arc? As we look back over the 6 weeks, all the music we've talked about, the story that we've been telling about the group, what does this look like now? We spent a lot of time looking at the individual trees. Now let's take a step back and see, how does the forest shape up here? What can we really sort of say by way of conclusion? Well, the early years of the Beatles are mostly of them as a cover band, performing extensively while John and Paul are writing their own songs along the way. So we talked earlier about how much music they played of other people, how they were truly, in almost the sense of a graduate student or somebody getting a bachelor's of music degree in popular music, truly students of American popular music as they were playing those clubs in Hamburg and playing Liverpool and all that they were doing. They really knew a lot of music, American pop. At the same time, were writing their own songs, developing their songwriting technique and their songwriting prowess. Their first years, I have argued, cast them mostly as pop craftsmen. That is, that their goals were no more ambitious than just being the best craftsmen of pop music they could possibly be. Writing hit songs, but doing it with a kind of integrity of craft that proved to everybody that they were able to do this as well as some of the most established professionals in the popular music business. I would say that A Hard Day's Night from the summer of 1964 is the high point of that pop craftsman approach. After that, we begin to see increasing musical ambition and experimentation amidst continued use of craft elements. So as we go through Beatles for Sale and Help and Rubber Soul and Revolver towards Sgt. Pepper, it isn't that the ambition and the experimentation takes over completely. Still, we see lots of the craft elements remaining. They're never absent from Beatles recordings. When they want hit singles, they rely on it a lot more, the craft element of it, that is, and they're a lot less experimental when it comes to the hit singles, because the hit singles are the revenue generator that makes the whole rest of the thing go. So you can take some chances on your album tracks, you can try new things, but a single, you got to have a hit single, because that's what allows you to continue to have the freedom to experiment. One point I think is that I hold about the Beatles is that they took the freedom that because they were so popular, they were able to do things in the studio that most other groups weren't able to do. They had a lot of freedom. And a lot of people would have gotten famous and gotten rich and just kept doing the same thing over and over again until they stopped getting famous and rich. But the Beatles took that freedom that they earned by their success and reinvested it in doing new and different kinds of things with their music. If they were a business, they would be reinvesting in R&D, in research and development. And by doing that, they not only pushed their own music forward in interesting and ambitious kinds of ways, but they pushed all of pop music forward. And that's what we start getting after A Hard Day's Night as we work our way towards Sgt. Pepper. Of course, I would say that what also happens at that time is we start to see the emergence of three distinctive songwriters. When we follow the track of John Lennon as he develops, the track of Paul McCartney as he develops, and the track of George Harrison as he develops. George Harrison maybe a couple of steps behind the other two guys, but certainly by the time we get to Abbey Road, he's holding his own. Thank you very much. So you see these three songwriters developing during the period sort of after maybe with the Beatles or something like that. And then the arrival of the artist model, that is moving away from the craft model to the artist model, we get with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band for sure in 1967. So if you take the summer of 1964 and A Hard Day's Night as the sort of the pinnacle of the pop craftsman thing, and Sgt. Pepper from the summer of 1967 as the real clear point of arrival in the artist model, then you're really looking at a kind of a 3-year growth period from craft to art, and that is really the trajectory up to becoming perfect or very, very accomplished and excellent pop craftsmen, transitioning from pop craftsmen to sort of more artist approach, and then in the period after that, a retreat from a psychedelia and a growth of the singer-songwriter approach. So as after Magical Mystery Tour and all that went with that, with the White Album and Get Back, we see them getting away from some of the psychedelic stuff, not necessarily away from musical ambition, but becoming more singer-songwriters, as we said with the White Album, a kind of a co-op of songwriters working together to do each other's songs. I would argue that in many ways, Abbey Road provides not only a final synthesis, but also the best balance that the Beatles were able to strike between pop craft and artistic ambition. We see in Abbey Road almost all of the features that we've been talking about in the period leading up to it, ever since really the beginning of the group. That whole trend sort of comes together in Abbey Road. It's fantastic that one of the best and most popular pop groups of all time, that the last album is so much that way. It's so much a synthesis and a coming together of everything, and that the second side of it really seems to be a kind of a goodbye to their it could have worked out a number of different ways. How many groups do you know that just sort of peter out at the end, and then it's just, they don't really go out with a bang? It's fantastic, especially for historians like me who tell the story, to be able to end the story that way. But I really do think they find a final balance at the very end for that group, and Abbey Road is that point. So I guess for me, the big albums that are sort of the markers for the Beatles are A Hard Day's Night, Sgt. Pepper, and Abbey Road. And you can tell the whole story by how we get to the first one, how we move from the first one to the second one, if we move from the second one to the third one, and how the overall career arc leads us from the very beginnings of Please Please Me all the way to Abbey Road. Well, how will the Beatles be viewed? How are the Beatles viewed in history? One of the most important things, I think, for us to keep straight as we look at this from the point of view of a historian as opposed to the point of view of a fan or a music journalist, is to keep straight the difference between celebrity and musical contribution. A lot of times people are thought to be important in history because they're still around to reinforce their own celebrity. Or they die young and become kind of iconic legends and become sort of celebrities after, posthumously. But there comes a time when all of the people who experienced the Beatles when they were still alive, the Beatles themselves will be gone, Ringo and Paul will be gone, and most of the fans who remember them from the 60s, even the 70s, 80s will be gone. 50 years from now, most everybody who relishes the fantastic celebrity of Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr will be gone, as will Paul and Ringo. That's just the way it is. What will be left? And I think right now, part of the Beatles' current profile, part of the reason why so many of you are interested in taking a course like this is because they are still fantastic celebrities. I mean, who of us wouldn't go way out of our way if we thought we'd have a chance to meet Paul McCartney or Ringo Starr, stand in their presence and shake their head? Come on, they're fantastic celebrities. It's a wonderful. And it doesn't really have anything to do with whether they would do good music when we talk to them. If we just, they're celebrities. Hey, what kind of, it isn't just rock stars who are celebrities. Classical musicians are celebrities too. That's a part of our culture. It's a part of the way things work, and it's been that way for hundreds of years. This is not something that's new. But after there aren't people there, 50 years from now, what will remain will be the music and the musical contribution that the Beatles made. People like me will have to explain to students that there even was this whole celebrity phenomenon. They'll tell them the stories of the Beatles on Ed Sullivan and the Screaming Girls and show them the clips. And people will look at it and go, wow, I never knew. Because we'll still be talking about the Beatles in 50 years, but we will no longer be focusing so much on their celebrity. We'll be focusing, scholars will, and historians and academics, and those are probably the ones who will be talking about it the most, will still be focused, they will be focusing on the music itself like we've done most of the way through this course. So when the celebrity's gone, it's the music that will endure. I think the Beatles' music will be viewed as one of the most important contributions to popular music history in particular. When we think about popular music history, I think 50 years from now, everybody will acknowledge that the Beatles were an extremely important group. So if you want to think about it with regard to classical music, they will be to pop music what people like Mozart or Beethoven or Brahms are to the history of classical music. You know, people that you must understand if you're going to understand the way popular music unfolded. in the second half of the 20th century, say. But I would go even farther than that, and I would say in the history of music in the 20th century, I believe that the Beatles will be seen as major figures in the history of 20th century music and as we tell the history of music. So in the same breath that we talk about the importance of people like Schoenberg or Stravinsky or Bartók or Stockhausen or Pierre Boulez or Messiaen, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, we'll be talking about the Beatles. And they won't be the only ones. We'll be talking about Dylan and others, but they will be in that pantheon of people that we think about as being important, but not because they were celebrities and not because of all the crazy stuff that goes on around the fan mania around the Beatles, but because the music itself will endure, not only for the quality of the music, but for how much it affected so much of the music that followed immediately after it. If it weren't for the Beatles, a lot of things in all parts of music history wouldn't have turned out the way they've turned out in this period since they first arrived on the scene in the UK in '63 and in the US in '64. Really, who can tell the story of music in the second half of the 20th century without understanding the Beatles? Impossible. I want to thank you for joining me for this course. It's been a fantastic privilege to talk about this wonderful music with you, and it's been a wonderful privilege to have you with me this whole time.